the students, and let me introduce our key speaker today is Robert Hoppe, who's already teaching with us for the second week, and it was the 5th lecture today, and he's a professor of knowledge at the University of Twente, and he's an expert on public policy and how the public policy is being developed and how it's also been introduced to various policy-making institutions. And and you correct me if I've done something wrong or too far, is the boundary work in particular, how those different communities that design policy and that are supposed to implement policies, how can they work together? Because it's the hardest part. We all design policies and then we are surprised why the decision makers are not listening to us. So today we will do the kind of research discussion seminar. So we really want to welcome the colleagues and the students. So the master students, they're supposed to benefit from what we do, because the goal of that is to find the ways and the paths of our own development. Because the beautiful pages on there are the different courses in public policy analysis and comparative public policy that are taught in more than 15 different schools around the world. And I've taken them from the conference in Leuven. That was also a celebratory conference of the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis that is edited by Iris Yevane, with whom we cooperate, and I'm a member of the board. So I would also cover a little bit of that, because these are also avenues, the possibilities of our own development. So what I asked Rob to do is to make an overview of existing schools, because there are many, existing schools of public policy analysis and existing schools of probably interpretive public policy, or kind of different focuses that different schools make, so that we might discuss what would be most interesting, most effective, and probably serving the goals of policy consulting here in Russia and the countries of NIS. Because if we are a department within High School of Economics, we really want to kind of catch the trend, which would be useful, and also link ourselves to some of the global schools, some of the global trends. So why don't I ask the colleagues who are not from the department, students, introduce themselves so Rob knows who's visiting.
Learning Belyaeva Center for Studies of Civil Society and Building Profit Center, also here in High School of Economics.
And important that Gulnara has a degree in public policy from American University.
University of Minnesota.
Right. You?
Я говорить могу только по-французски, на английском я могу только слушать.
Ну вы только себя тогда представьте, я переведу.
Анна Новикова, профессор факультета медиакоммуникации, доктор Culture Studies.
You should have been in the previous lecture, because Anna is teaching cultural studies in media communication department. He's professor, and she can understand English but can talk French. So you probably understand French, so you can ask her questions in French.
Zinaida Pogosova, criminal law department. I have a PhD in law, and
I know.
Assistant professor.
Azim is also a vice chair of department. What is your department?
Deputy head of criminal law department.
Criminal law. But what's important, she does a lot of comparative studies. And we're discussing that she would design a course together with Yuri Fagilson on the criminal policies, as type of policies we develop. And probably you know all the rest. Edgar, we met. Yes, and then probably you don't know Artyom. Introduce yourself.
I am postgraduate student here in public policy department, first year. So I'm new here.
So he might be the one to join the PhD school in Twente. So here we are. So probably you need to start to give us an overview of the schools, because my very short introduction is that when the Leuven conference tried to bring together the scholars that were really devoted to comparison and the comparative methods in public policy studies and policy implementation, they also designed a very interesting exercise that we all really loved. Is that there are so many schools, there were about more than 30 schools, representatives participating all over Europe and United States, and many of them teach public policy, and many of them do research, but they all do it in completely different ways. So I just want to kind of handpick a couple of those who I personally know, because you would have, although policy analysts would know the name of Kent Weaver, right? Because the book of Kent Weaver on think tanks is really quoted and done very widely, and he has a course in Georgetown. It's a comparative policy process. And the key objective is also to see why don't policymakers always choose the most efficient policies. That's the questions we all ask. And why do policymakers facing similar policy dilemmas, like different choices? How do actors mold their policy proposals and actions to achieve their objectives? And what sort of strategies do they use? So I'm not reading all the course, but it's just the focus of it. And if we will take a very different one of like Levi-Strauss, the one I also like, he teaches in Israel and he has so many different schools and conferences and developed his own schools. This is comparative methods in political and social research, which is, deals very much with social policy and developing the policy, but the goals are completely different. And intelligent political criticism has to be comparative. It deals not with all or none situations, but with practical alternatives. And public and its problems is the core discussion. Some of the best works in the field of political science are using the comparative method. And comparative analysis, especially in public policy, have to be cross-national comparative analysis. So this is cross-national comparative analysis. So close to us, but really very different. And from across Europe and the other one I really want to introduce. This is the one that I like the most. This is from Lee Kuan Yew. This is Singapore. And Singapore is now becoming one of the very visible schools of public policy because they do devote a lot of resources to it. And they also volunteered to sponsor probably the third conference on international conference in public policy. The first was in Grenoble last summer, where the department played a very important role. And then next year we would have a conference on public policy studies in Milano. And the third would be hosted, they already agreed, in Lee Kuan Yew, just to have the different perspectives, different global perspectives. They designed something that Policy Design Lab. So focusing on how policy are designed. And also make a depository of different styles, close to what Rob was discussing today, and also making it available to policymakers so that they can pick the pieces and apply somewhere. So, and it also allows me to quote what we've studied. And when we built up the public policy department, we also had a motto, an explanation, what are we doing? And this is political analysis and public policy is a new research sphere. For Russia, it is pretty new. And that is being developed at High School of Economics. And the group of researchers that doing it together, and the aim of is to establish a school of thought in public policy and political analysis. So our initial goal was just to differentiate this field from others, from traditional political science and from administrative sciences, because we feel it's somewhere in between, but have to be recognized as a really on its own. And the master program opened in 2006, and it aimed at preparing graduates specializing in public policy analysis. And their skills and competences allow them to be successful both in research and in management and in policy analysis. So many of our students who graduate, they work at consulting firms and think tanks. And that's what we hope where you would be after you graduate. But there's also so many ways to teach about public policy. So this is why I really want to hear from Rob's expertise. What are the schools? So that we should know about these varieties. And probably some of them might be more possible for us to join. And that's what I want to discuss with all of you. That's it for my introduction. Now the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Well, it's quite a tall order actually to talk about all the different
But the ones you know,
Well,
yes.
only the ones I know. I would like to kind of trace it all through history. See what are the major trends in policy studies and in policy analysis, and then come up with a couple of key distinctions, because you're right, I mean, all these different schools, especially if they focus on comparative policy analysis, you have great differences, but they all, one way or another, also have the same focus or have the same major trends and major aims and goals. And of course, you do stress your specific characteristics because you want to attract as many students as possible. But still, I've seen it also as my task to kind of filter out what are the major points, and this is best done by giving you a brief historical overview of policy analysis from, say, the 1960s until, well, approximately now. I would say public policy has historically developed out of political science. Also, if you look at the history, especially in the United States, where It started in the 1950s and the 1960s, although if you go back to in the European tradition, you would find in the late 17th, the beginning 18th centuries, already the beginnings of a policy science as part of the old absolute monarchies, who were discovering that in order for their subjects to serve them well, they had to serve the subjects well, which is still the essence of public policy making, essentially, namely that the civil population of a particular state do indeed feel well and flourish, but at the same time thereby create an atmosphere that they can be governed and that the government is accepted, legitimate, etc., etc. There are all kinds of reasons why that didn't come off the ground at that moment, but I will not go into that. Practically, the way we do policy analysis now, it all goes back to Harold Laswell and David Lerner, who in the mid-1950s, beginning of the 1960s, relaunched policy studies and policy analysis in the United States. And interestingly, for policy department here that focuses so much on human rights.
We are exceptional, no one else does. I think we are very special in that.
You're too fast, you're too fast. Harold Laswell, in the 50s, established policy analysis with a view to what he said, human dignity. Because he had seen what happened in fascist Europe. He had done a lot of psychological mass communication type of research into propaganda. He had lived through the Second World War from the American side, but he himself had German roots. So he was appalled at the cruelty and the indignity of war. And what he wanted to do is to create government, recreate government in such a way that it would actually stimulate human dignity instead of, and part of that of course was democracy, rule of law, and what you now would call human rights. We also know that the system of human rights, the Universal Declaration, came out of activity immediately after the Second World War, adopted by the United Nations. And he was thinking, well, if that is really our code of conduct, if that is really our ethical system, you need to unite the sciences to inform government with the best available knowledge in order to really bring about human dignity all over the world, essentially. But especially in America, of course, because that's where he was working. So that was the beginning, and indeed, you're right, it was different from political science, although it started inside political science. Although, I must say, Harold Laswell himself was a legal scholar who combined law and politics, essentially, and psychology. He was a really very interdisciplinary figure already in the 1950s. And what he did was said, okay, we need a policy science, and policy science essentially is bringing to the government, making available to governments, to policymakers, the best available knowledge. And that meant it was interdisciplinary already. It was also problem-oriented, because he said it should not be disciplinary-oriented research that we do. No, it should be problem-oriented research. The problems of ordinary people should be central to what we analyze. Which meant also that it would be multi-method. You could not say we are political scientists, we do surveys, or we are economists and we do modeling. No, all these different methods had to be united to create the best possible knowledge. And that is, I think, best reflected in a definition by Bill Dunn, a famous American policy scientist, who says, policy analysis is an applied social science, that uses a variety of research methods. It doesn't rely on one favorite or a couple of favorites. No, it just uses all the research methods that somehow are necessary to solve problems for ordinary citizens. And it does so not in an academic climate, but it does so in an atmosphere, in an external environment that is dominated by political argumentation, policy debate, and of course power politics. So you should not do policy analysis only within the walls of academic life. No, you should go out into practice and do it there as well. And you should create policy relevant knowledge by focusing on the outside. Now this meant two things for policy analysis. First, it meant you need to understand the policy-making process as a dynamic social process better than we do so far. That would be step one, and it would be, say, traditional academic scientific study of public policy as a phenomenon. But second, it would mean you need knowledge to be practical in policy making itself, which is, well, policy analysis. I would say policy studies is the academic part, and policy analysis is the more applied part. And these are different. And so what you see in the different schools of public policy analysis that are around now is still a basic trend in the direction of just understanding, developing hypotheses, theories of the long-term dynamics or the short-term dynamics of policy making or decision making, or however it's called. And on the other hand, you see much more practical ways of designing and evaluating public policy in practice. And this is still, I would say, a basic choice that you would have to make. And the interesting thing is that, I mean, you were on this conference which is about the comparative method in policy studies. The comparative methods can also be used for these two different purposes. You can use comparative method to gain better understanding of long-term policy processes by saying in the United States it goes this way, in Europe it goes this way, in Russia it goes this way, in China it's other, in Singapore, which is by the way a very small, rather autocratic country, so how average is that for the rest of the world is a question you could ask. This means that the comparative method could be used for purely academic purpose, but of course you could also, I want to learn from how policy is made in America. I want to learn how it's done in Holland. I want to learn about how it's done in England, and then see what is applicable in my own country.
Now everybody's settled quietly. We have still 3 chairs, so you're afraid to sit in front. I understand everybody on the pack back there. But I hope now everybody is in, and
Okay.
We can continue.
I will continue. So this is the basic choice that still has to be made. Are you going in one direction or the
More
other
about
direction?
knowledge and research,
Or do
about
you
how
want-
policy is done,
or
and
do
also
you
how
want-
policy is implemented.
Or do you want to combine? Because, of course, I mean, my view, my personal view, would be why would you want to understand policy-making processes better in order to be able to really make practical policymakers improve their performance? That's why you need better knowledge of the policy-making processes. So my choice would be to combine it.
That's exactly how we built ourselves, because it's public policy analysis, political analysis and public policy. Because from the day one, we thought that this is going to be master of arts rather than master of sciences. So not to be just theory for serious and research for research's sake, but also have a very serious research in how policy is made and who does it serve, to be able to do the policy advice, to be consultants, to be possible to provide policy papers in order to make policies better. So it has to be both, to me, because otherwise it won't be.
Okay, but still, if you think further, then the next step indeed is who will you serve?
We're hoping the public.
That's what you say, but that's not the answer that most policy analysts have given to that question, because from the very beginning there has been a fight, intellectual fight, about whom to serve, essentially. And there were those who were more inspired by economic theories, Schumpeter, kind of person who would argue that ordinary citizens are just incapable of intelligent and informed political judgment, so by definition, policy studies and policy analysis is an elitist activity. So if you serve anybody, you serve the government. And there were those, from a more Deweyan perspective, and Laswell himself was ambivalent about this issue. He said, no, in essence, the public, in public policy and also in public administration, the public is in principle everybody who is affected positively or negatively in his or her interests through a particular governmental policy. And that actually meant that you would have to include those people into the policy-making process. At least you would have to give them a voice, and not only rely on representative democracy or on scientific expertise or on bureaucratic expertise to hammer out the policies and then impose them somehow nationwide over a particular population. So from the beginning there was also a divide between people who were, say, for more participatory styles, more interpretive styles of policy analysis, taking the ordinary citizen really very seriously, and those who would argue, no, if you have economic expertise, if you have social science expertise, that's enough. The only thing you have to do is to turn that knowledge into something usable by government. Usable knowledge was the word. And later on, this developed into essentially, I would say, a type of theory, also in policy studies, that was very public choice oriented, positivistic social science, economically inspired political theory, turned into policy analysis, but only policy analysis by experts for experts in government. And on the other hand, and personally I belong to that other school, I was part of the movement that protested this, and which has led to a book, The Argumentative Turn in Policy Analysis, edited by Frank Fisher and John Forrester. I have a chapter in there, which said, no, if you take the citizen more seriously, you have to have a more interpretive, hermeneutic approach to policy analysis. Essentially, it is not telling truth, scientific truth, to power, but it's making sense together. You should include all the different stakeholders and try to make sense together, and that would be the policy, the sense that you make together. So this would be also a very basic choice, apart from being there for academic purposes or for practical purposes. If you choose for practical purposes, are you there for the experts and the governmental top dogs only, or are you there for essentially ordinary citizens and the way they should be able to influence policy as well, through participatory, interpretive, deliberative methods of doing policy analysis. So this, I would say, in different combinations would make for all these different schools in the world of policy analysis. And then, of course, there are also a couple of, I would say, mega trends that do affect policy analysis and make it different from how Laswell and others conceptualized it from the beginning. Because let's face it, in the 60s, everybody believed in the wholesome, the benign function of science for society. We are in Russia here, and one of the big tenets of Marxism at the time was, we know how history will develop because we have the best theory. We know how it will go. And modernity, modern thinking, not only Marxism, but also the more liberal type of modern thinking, thought exactly the same. So science was kind of unquestioned. It was, if you wanted the best knowledge, it would be scientific. knowledge. But now we have a couple of developments in the world. First of all, we have globalization. Globalization means that the power of governments is eroded, or at least that you, as a nation state, have to take into account global development much more than you did before. This country, but also in the Netherlands, well, in Holland it's not the oil prices, but prices of export products that are very important for economic well-being and therefore for citizens as voters is very important. So globalization was far less developed then than it is now. So it's no longer self-evident that you focus on the government as your target for policy analysis. You might do it for an international organization. Or you might do it for an NGO, a non-governmental organization, international or national or regional or whatever, because erosion of the government means more power for civil society, or at least more room for initiatives from civil society. So, where for Lasswell it was still very clear that you would have to target the government and proximate policymakers inside government as the targets for your policy analysis. Now, the target is kind of much more dispersed and you have more choice as a policy analyst, as long, of course, that they are interested in your message, which may not be the case in particular. So that is one very important difference. Another one, but this is perhaps more visible in the West than in other parts of the world, we have moved into what we call a risk society, or a risk combined with knowledge society. Knowledge society means that knowledge itself has become a productive factor. I mean, it used to be the case that only labor and capital were considered to be productive factors, and coffee, of course. But nowadays, there are a lot of very good arguments, for instance, by Peter Drucker and other people in economics who have argued that no, intellectual development, knowledge resources,
The whole knowledge economy idea.
the knowledge
is so
economy,
powerful.
knowledge society idea has become very, very important. And this, of course, goes together with the idea that it's not only the experts that are important, it's the entire population's knowledge that is important. As a matter of fact, there is a lot of distrust, at least in the West, against purely expert knowledge, also because the experts haven't been able to anticipate, for instance, the risks of nuclear energy. They haven't been able to control the quality of food. They haven't been able to control the negative side effects of a pharmaceutical industry. They haven't been able to foresee climate change.
And the economic crisis.
And
the pollution.
And in
and so many other
2008, particularly, the ecological, but also the banking crisis. As a matter of fact, the fall of communism was, I think, incorrectly interpreted as the triumph of capitalism, whereas they didn't see that capitalism itself also became more and more into crisis, ecologically, but also financially, which is very clear now. So in that sense, we are really stuck. And this is, on the one hand, very different from how Lasswell, who lived in a time of optimism and science will produce the solutions for the big challenges in society. And now, well, we're really kind of stuck. I mean, there's a dearth of really good ideas, and there's even some I would say, pessimism about whether or not we can really get out of there. Anyway, it means government is no longer the target, so it's broader. Expertise is more or less distrusted, which is something that we as policy analysts have to take into account, because we cannot just parade as the big experts anymore, because we would be distrusted. Which is one reason why this participatory and deliberative policy analysis has gained popularity, because from that perspective, from deliberation perspective, from participation perspective, the policy analyst is someone who moderates, facilitates the input of knowledge by not only experts but also ordinary people in the policy-making process. He or she becomes a manager of democracy, but in the good sense of the word. Not creating new political parties that have no function at all, but creating policy-making processes where the inputs are really from the public, in the best sense of the word. So I would say that policy analysis has to change its character. It has to become more participatory, more deliberative. And as scientists, and policy analysis of course still finds its cradle, its point of departure in the academic world, we have to learn how to cross the boundaries, not only to government, but also to civil society organizations. And that's one of the reasons why I think that what I call boundary work or boundary organization is so very important. Well, my colleague Gerhard Ermicher, who was also here, is a guy who is, I think, exceptionally skillful in creating coalitions, productive, creative coalitions between the way scientists work, in his case landscaping and archaeology and history, and ordinary people. And this is what we as policy analysts all should learn how to do well. And of course that depends on the nature of the political system, how you can do that, and whether or not you can do it, because there are of course political systems who are just dead against involving the normal public into policy analysis and policy making. There are more and less democratic countries. Still, this is the direction that policy analysis has taken, and it's another essential choice that you would have to make if you want to make a school of public policy analysis. And of course, there are all kinds of shades and differences and mixes, etc. And you have them all here out on the table. And somehow, here at the Higher School of Economics, you would have to eke out your own niche of doing policy analysis in such a way that it is useful for, well, Russian citizens, but also maybe the global citizens.
And let me start a discussion here, because I've captured several ideas that I also want to test with you, because there was a very famous phrase when we studied think tanks with Dmitry, who was yet then a student of bachelor's, that this idea of telling truth to power, particularly in Russia 10 years ago, was so powerful, because there was a kind of a vision that scientists are not brave enough, are not open enough, so they cannot challenge the power. So as far as we as analysts would be decent and we'll tell them the truth. So it's only the question of our kind of rigor and courage and clarity. So it's all about that we tell them the truth and they just catch the truth and start implementing that. But the more we were telling the truth, it wasn't helpful. We were seeing that there are many people telling different truths, but they were all trying to kind of attack the power. And the power kind of distancing from that, and even there were different levels of power. And then we kind of start to understand this is very elitist, that we kind of talking in a very narrow circle. And then there was a whole cluster of analysts that just lived in the power, like lived with their cabinets. And that was also considered in the question of the policy design system of what Michael Howard is developing, like in-house, inside power analysts and outside the power. And it was the whole body of development that those who were considered to be in were more effective, because they were just hired to be working with government. And so they were exactly kind of writing the decisions, either the laws or budgets or proposals, or like serving in direct way.
Policy analysis is a hired gun.
Yeah, exactly. And then we witnessed how many of those independent institutions that were developing in the beginning of 90s, gradually shifted to kind of finding their space within governments of different sorts. And they were thinking that that's the best fate they could have. So the closer to power, the better. But what happened later was the otherwise around. So when we see how these analysts who felt very cozy within the power, was one of the other were thrown out, because they were not able, capable, or courageous or whatever, or power stopped hearing from them. The story of Foundation of Effective Politics is number one on the row, because when we analyzed it 10 years ago, it was rated #1 analytical agency, that everybody from our students wanted to end up working in Foundation of Effective Politics. What happened then, everybody know that the head of the foundation was kind of ousted from Kremlin, and the foundation is nowhere. And so this strategy didn't prove to be the most effective one. And so then people start to elaborate. Probably kind of being the closer to power is not necessarily the best way. So that advocacy works better than lobbying, when you have to kind of share your ideas with broader public. So then they would understand what's the better way to govern economy, to organize a migration policy, to organize the educational policy, or the healthcare and pensions and so on. And then they would be the ones that kind of delegate their beliefs, that you would infiltrate in power making. And then you can kind of capture that, articulate it better, and sign up that policy. So it's a completely different cycle. So it doesn't mean you have to be kind of physically and organizationally as close as possible, but instead you have to work with a particular public. If you work with environmental issues, then you have to work with a kind of environmentally educated public and concerned and interested. So you can develop it together. And the same with every other field of policy making. So that was shift. So this is why when we were designing how do we want to make it, so it immediately was coming together with human rights, citizens' involvement, civil society aspect. And what was also interesting to notice that our graduates are working mostly in NGOs and think tanks in media. So media, I'm just looking at the media faculty, is becoming a very, very strong consumer of people with public policy analytic skills, because they want to write about it and they want qualified people. So several people from media communication, excellent bachelors, also joining the public policy program, because they see how they can learn more and then go back to media. And we also have the trend of the legal science, and then again, media field is so important for policy communication. You have to hear from people to understand what their concerns are, and then you know how to work with people through media to explain and deliberate what kind of policy you want to show on. Because so we can't live without media. That's why we have Anna Nikitina, who is an expert and was also teaching in media communication and teaches this dialogue methods and kind of hearing, understanding text, withdrawing meaning from the texts. But also the law is so important, because in public policy is a strong field of regulatory governance. Because how can you make policies kind of implemented? You have to design a law, you have to design regulation of some sort. But now we don't see regulation as only federal laws. We also see regulations as soft power, as soft law, and agreements people make among themselves and kind of agree to follow them. So rule creation is also making among people, not only above them. And so if those who've been at the lecture, these egalitarians, they only follow the rules that they participate in creating. I just love it. Because if I had nothing to do in creation, the rules, why should I obey? I just don't follow them. I don't trust them. I don't believe they're true, that they're serving my goals. So there are more and more communities that develop that are involved in rulemaking. Recently, it's an interesting example, I was busy reading it all last night, is that our vice rectors are sending us messages that they're all now concerned with lack of academic self-governance in High School of Economics. And they're making interesting examples that they're too bureaucratic. The people like the professors and the others are really complaining that it's too bureaucratic, that they don't have any input in decision making, and now various initiatives are being installed of having more self-governance in different ways, and for the very simple reason is that if people don't participate in rulemaking, they don't feel like they really have to obey. They're not motivated. And this is also part of public policy. And for specific types of governance, that's what I want to argue with you. And I also want you to be involved in some way, as we had a debate in a previous talk, that public policy is hard to keep it as an independent, as a space of knowledge that would be recognizable. Because each of those people, after they graduate, after they're very bright experts, they would end up either consulting health policy making, or they consult, transport policy making, or economic financial policies. So they all kind of torn apart to specific fields of knowledge. And basically we're kind of losing the people who can make the core of policy analysts, kind of keeping them together in one department, in one school, in one space. So, and that was your argument, that they would rather kind of switch to specific decision-making field, kind of more administrative approach. And we do have it here in our School of Administration. They have some analysis that are tied up very closely to health, pension, regional studies and so on. But what we see is lacking all of that body of knowledge that you were talking, these clusters of culture, that patterns of behavior, that are rules of policy analysis methods are completely lacking, because they're starting advising from what they see is happening now. So it's extrapolation or immediate term with none of this analysis going on. And this is why this is a probable outcome that many of these advices are not really serving the governance. Example, here in High School of Economics, and I'm getting controversial here, and I'm welcoming the feedback and reaction, we have an Institute of Governance that was providing like 3 or 4 governance reforms. And we don't see it's making government better. And they're all constantly complaining that they're not being heard, or what they implement is implemented on behalf of that, or like in the wrong way, or it just, though they were hired, they got the grants from government. So I think this is something wrong in the whole design. So this is why we're turning to something which Howlett and his team calls policy design and policy environment. And who and how creates it, where is it being cooked, how it's being spread, who is being translating it, and who is supposed to hear it. Because this is an ever rising issue. We keep producing good knowledge, and this is not being used at all, or being used wrongly. And so if there is anything, any advice or good practices, how to overcome that gap, because the analyst sitting kind of on one corner and producing all this good advice, and the decision makers are sitting on the other corner, and there's really not much happening between them.
No. Well, I mean, that's almost inevitable, simply because, as you say, the moment as a policy analyst or as a student of public policy, you go to the empirical world to study some particular topic, you have to become one of the experts that are already there. Either practical experts, like bureaucrats who implement particular policy, or street-level bureaucrats, as they're frequently called, or other scientists. I mean, if you talk about energy, well, there are a lot of engineers who know how to produce energy, and energy policy is essentially coordinating, orchestrating the many different initiatives that there are out there in terms of innovation of engineering techniques, etc., that produce energy. Same goes for healthcare. I mean, if you're talking about hospitals and hospital management, very different ideas about this. But if you want to say anything useful as a policy analysis about healthcare, you have to become an expert in that too. So there is this natural tendency in policy analysis to spread out over all the different professional areas that are already there. And make no mistake about it, if you think about it, there's thousands of different knowledge systems or professions that are out there. And still what you want to do is to kind of get out of these different professional fields those elements that are generalizable, because it would improve the functioning of these professionals if they only knew that, well, for instance, how to create systems where you can cross boundaries between the academic world and outside professionals, but also professionals inside the government. And this is hard to do. This is hard work. As you said, I mean, for a while you're embraced by the government as, yes, you bring us exactly the type of knowledge that we now need. But yes, then policies change and governments change, or they change their minds.
Leadership changes and their attitudes.
Out you go. Which means that if you want to be of lasting impact, you have to kind of have a kind of in-between position between university, between civil society associations, and between government. This is something that we have learned how to do in certain countries. But I mean, in Holland you have...
Does it work in Holland? That's what I want to say. So how does it work?
Yes, you do. You have, for
we're looking
instance,
for some positive examples where it can work.
To give you a positive example, we do have a Center of Economic Policy Analysis, which prepares biannual economic lookouts and analyses, which are used in the budgetary negotiations between political parties that make up the government.
Ah. That's a traditional regulated
norm. Even more, if there is an electoral campaign by different political parties, they are required to translate their campaign statements into such terms that they can be fed into the economic models of the Center of Economic Policy Analysis. They calculate the outcomes, and they're kind of reported back in the newspaper so that citizens have a kind of rational idea. If this political party alone would govern, this would be the impact on employment, on profits, on taxes, etc., etc. Okay, that is one way of sharing policy analysis through the media, done by one particular expert body who has an in-between role between academia and government, and has special connections to media. And somehow they manage to balance this.
This is academic body that kind of retranslates?
No. It is formally, it is a body that is part of the Ministry of Economic Affairs.
Ah.
But it is organized in such a way that, I mean, the board that governs this Center of Economic Policy Makers is made up of politicians, of academicians, famous professors, and of course the people that work there.
So it's already kind of boundaries blurred, they're
Exactly.
working in one body.
And they work in one body, and they know that somehow they have to pay respect to or take into account the views of all these different people who do produce the knowledge, who consume the knowledge. And the consumers of this kind of knowledge is not only the government, it's also the peak associations of labor, it's the peak associations of employees' organizations. And through the media, it's even ordinary Dutch citizens who have to decide which party to vote for. And somehow this is allowed because, well, I mean, you could say it has to be an academic body. Let's face it, they produce knowledge. Or no, they do it for the government, so they should be bureaucrats, should be inside. No, we deliberately create a kind of in-between sphere which is allowed from both parties, both from the academic world and from the practical world, and we create a governance system for this particular institute in which all these different stakeholders keep each other accountable for the results. And now, you would ask, for instance, the economic models that they use. Are they purely science? No, they're not. Because the long-term indicator systems that they use, econometric modeling, has to sometimes change because major theories change, and major theories change because of policies change. Think about the difference between Keynesianism and later neoliberalist theories. This meant a big change in the models that this center was using. But by combining both political trends and the most recent economic insights and saying they're actually equal in impact and there should be a balance between them, you create an in-between sphere where both parties can say we can profitably use the type of knowledge that is being produced instead of being kicked out or drawn into government, like the case that you mentioned here in Russia. And this is what I call hybrid management, as these boundary type of institutions, as knowledge producers for government policy, ought to be able to balance these different interests in the way they produce usable knowledge without giving up their academic neutrality. That of course is key. You have to be neutral, you have to be able to serve different governments. If the government changes from leftist to rightist, it would still have to work with this institute. And somehow we have created the institutional balances that this in-between, blurring the boundaries institutions do actually function. And personally, I think policy analysis cannot flourish if you do not have these boundary arrangements. If you have it only inside academic life or only inside the bureaucracy, it will always flounder in the end. It will be popular for a while. Maybe it can be a purely academic affair for 10 years or for 15 years, but then it will be gone, simply because it has no impact. And you have it because you want it to have impact.
Right. So I want to open for questions now. So on anything, like what public policy means, what it means to you, what kind of professions, because we heard from students they were not clear where they can go to work, and so what is the possible outcomes, or where they plan to work, or what they see their, how they can apply their knowledge, on any questions, whether it's for Dutch system of boundary work, or for the future that we can see for ourselves.
Well, it's not only in Holland.
Yeah, it's broader.
Broad.
Broader. So, any questions? Any questions? While you're thinking of questions, I have the first one close to what Edgar was teaching us and trying to teach the students, is a particular econometric and indicators. Because if we think of policy knowledge as and public policy analysis work as generating knowledge that has policy relevance, then we speak about the difficulty and the deepness of that knowledge. We can just say, this is party for people, and this is party for bureaucrats, or this is party for elite, and this is party for pensioners. But this is never right. This is always a lot in between. So, but how difficult, how specific could be these indicators of particular programs that the broad public could understand? Because what I learned from students, that they had hard time to understand econometrics, and they were struggling, and they're not sure they really got all of it. But they're students of master program, and they have hard time understanding econometrics. So, what is the level of difficulty of knowledge that could be used by the broad public? How can we measure how much the broad public can consume, in which detail of that indicators we have to show it? Is there any advice on that? Because that's what all the media and all the public policy analysts are struggling with, exactly that, saying for experts we can have that thick table of tables and numbers and everything, even the budgets would be that thick 17 books, but citizens won't understand it. And so to make it understandable, you reduce it to some very easy things, but they are not having the true answers. So there have to be something in between, but it is very hard to craft. To which detail you break out these indicators to make it both meaningful and truly reflecting what one or the other political decision and policy would look like, and to make it understandable by broad citizens. How it's being defined.
Is that a question to me?
I know, just question to everybody. I know. Would you as citizens love to read the very detailed indicators in paper? Would the papers be ready to position the specific programs and policy analysis with all the numbers and schemes? And how many people would be interested and devoted to really understand all that in depth? Because that matching really starts here between elitist academic and broad public. There is really hardly difficult to define the field in which their knowledge would match. To me, I just think this is one of the questions that we need to think about. And so I would love any contribution to that.
Now let me just give you one example, not of economic policy, but HIV/AIDS.
Which one? AIDS.
AIDS.
Okay.
Human immunodeficiency syndrome. When it came up,